Today we're going to talk about rereading. So I typically never really make the time to reread books. I have so many books unread that I have not experienced left on my shelves that I struggle to sort of justify devoting the time to rereading when I could be ticking another unread book off my TBR. And I think so many people that create content around books and reading on the internet struggle to shift that mindset of constantly wanting to consume like a new thing, to say that you have read X amount of books, to always want to be experiencing something new. And it's also particularly tricky when there are so many more amazing books coming out. The physical TBR just keeps growing and growing. And this is a situation of my own making, okay? I'm the only one that is deciding to buy books and grow my TBR. And I'm definitely someone that does enjoy having quite an extensive catalogue of unread books from which to choose my next read. Now, I definitely think there's a scale of how comfortable I feel with my physical TBR numbers, and I think I'm a bit too far along the scale at the moment, and I do want to reduce the number of books on my physical TBR. But I'll never be someone that has like a 10 book unread shelf. Like, that's just not me. But I think because I always want to be reading books that are new to me, I do struggle to find the time to devote to rereading. And I think it's such a shame, because can you really say a book is one of your favorite books ever if you've not reread it? You know, if you've not experienced it at other points in your life than your initial reading. And I think it would be such a compelling and interesting reading experience to revisit a book that you initially found really impactful or enjoyable when you initially read it, to revisit it at another point in your life when you're maybe in a different like life stage or set of circumstances. And that's certainly how I feel about the books that I have picked off my shelves today to talk about. A couple of caveats: I have picked 5 books off my shelves, but there are also a number of books at my mother's house that I would really like to reread. I just don't have them to hand right now. My second caveat is that when I initially went to the bookshelves to pick some books off to talk about, I ended up picking almost exclusively Irish authors when I first started looking at things. So there will be a follow-up to this video in March where I specifically talk about books by Irish authors that I would like to reread. Now let's get to the books. I'm going to talk about these in the order in which I initially read them, and there are obviously like several year gaps in that chronology. But I think the most interesting way to have a conversation about these books is to go from the furthest amount of time in the past that I read these books up until now. Oh, actually, as I've been talking, I've thought of another couple of books that I would like to reread, so I'm going to add those to the pile. One of those books that I've just added is Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. So this is one of those books that I do say is one of my favourite books, and it is a book that I have reread multiple times. But I would like to make it a bit of an annual tradition to reread this, because I get so much joy out of it every time I read it. Now, I don't know exactly when I read this book for the first time. I know I did read it as a child, but I don't have a particularly strong, significant memory of the first time I read it. And I think in reality, I'd probably absorbed a lot of the story by osmosis, or by reading maybe abridged versions of it initially, seeing film adaptation. But I definitely did read the full novel at some point when I was a child. And then I definitely reread it at university, I think when I was maybe about 20. And I studied it as part of a Victorian childhoods module, and I loved that. And I got so much more out of the book when I reread it for that module. It just enriched my reading of experience of it so much. And I love how you can kind of take it as face value of this slightly strange, whimsical children's story, but there's also so much commentary in there around childhood during the Victorian era, so much kind of criticism around education systems at that time. There is so much to really dive into with this book, and I have reread it a couple of times even since studying it for that module. But I would really like to make this an annual tradition to reread this one, because I enjoy it so much. Because of how much I have reread this one, I do feel like this is the book on the list that is kind of cemented as a favourite book, whereas these other ones, I haven't reread them. So I would love to reread Looking for Alaska by John Green. So I was a massive reader as a child. I read so much, and then I think in my early sort of teenage years, I fell out of love with reading a little bit, kind of got distracted by other things, was spending more time on the internet, got my first boyfriend, was just very distracted. And I think that's an age where so many people do stop reading. But I remember making quite a conscious decision when I was maybe 15 or 16 that I wanted to get back into reading again. And oh my God, thank goodness I made that decision. And I was watching a lot of the Vlogbrothers at that time. So one Christmas, all I asked for was books. And I remember I got this box full of books, either by John Green or books that John Green had recommended. And this is the book that I credit with getting me back into reading as a teenager. It's so interesting to think about if I hadn't picked this book up, what my life would be. Like, I genuinely think picking up this book was so life-changing because of the impact that reading has on my life and the trajectory of my adulthood. And I actually don't really remember much about the content of this book, but I think like so many people, when I read it as a teenager, it was hugely impactful. And I would be intrigued to find out my response to it now as an adult reader. This next book I think I read when I was about 18, and I would really like to reread the initial Hunger Games trilogy, but specifically the first book in the series because I have this gorgeous illustrated edition of it, and I think that would be such an interesting and different way to re-experience that story. So I remember really wanting to watch the Hunger Games films, and I can't remember how many of them were out at this point. I think I was like 17 or 18 when this happened, but I definitely wanted to read the books before I watched any of the films. So I completely like blitzed through all 3 books. I devoured them, I inhaled them, and I thought they were so brilliant. But I have never revisited them, and I think now that I've got this gorgeous illustrated edition, it's the perfect way to re-experience and re-immerse myself in that story. I've not read like the prequel to the Hunger Games or any kind of the adjacent novels that have come out or are coming out around the initial trilogy. And I don't know if I necessarily have interest in reading them, but definitely want to reread at least the first book in the trilogy. Then I think when I was about 18 or 19, I read The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath for the first time. I had read quite a bit of Sylvia Plath's poetry at secondary school. And I think it was quite interesting because the quality of work I was producing around analysing Sylvia Plath's poetry was not as good as some of the like essays I was writing about other poets. And I do remember my English teacher saying at the time, oh, I think it's, you know, it's sort of clear that you don't get on with her poetry as much as some of the other ones, so let's focus on the other ones. But I think now I recognise that it was actually because I felt such a connection to her poetry when I was reading it at that age, you know, sort of 15, 16, 17, that I struggled to kind of be analytical and critical around it. So I went off to university and then discovered The Bell Jar for the first time, which was Sylvia Plath's novel. And honestly, I couldn't tell you really anything that happens in this beyond kind of remembering that it is a story of an American girl's struggles with mental health, you know, following her having this kind of mental breakdown. I'd actually struggle to remember any of the other plot details around it, but I definitely just remember like the feeling that it gave me reading this, and I found it so unlike anything else I'd read at the time. I found a real kind of connection to it, and I'd definitely be intrigued to reread this now, like as a 29-year-old woman that has, you know, more experience of womanhood and adulthood under her belt, and also a way more secure relationship with my mental state. So I think this one would be really fantastic to revisit and think about from that perspective. Now, this could just be all of this author's books, but I'm specifically going to mention After I Do by Taylor Jenkins Reid. Now, TJR is one of my favorite authors of all time. I will read absolutely anything that she writes. But the first book I read from her was After I Do, and this was before The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo like blew up. And I remember obviously The Seven Husbands blew up on TikTok a couple of years ago, but even a couple of years prior to that, it was all over like BookTube. And I read After I Do like before that. I liked Taylor Jenkins Reid before she was cool, but this is a romance between a man and a woman that fall in love in college. They get married, but a decade later, their marriage is at breaking point, and they decide that they're going to go for this year of like no contact. Then they're going to reconnect after a year and decide if they want to carry on with their relationship. So they have like a break from the marriage for a year. Now, I remember reading this book in the aftermath of a really bad breakup, and my little Delulu self convinced myself that I was gonna like reconnect with this relationship, that like he just needed time to figure it out and then we get back together. And like I was so dumb, I was so stupid, and I'm so glad that that's not what happened. But this was such an interesting book to have accidentally like picked up at that point, because it kind of fed into my Delulu, and I wonder what it would be like to reread this now that I'm not bringing so much of my own baggage to it. But also just in terms of how much I enjoy this author's writing, I would like to reread like all of her books because I've enjoyed all of them. But I must have been 22 when I read this. And then I think I was about 24 when I read The Black Flamingo by Dean Atta. I mean, this isn't one that I have a particularly sort of strong emotional connection to. This is just purely because I enjoyed this book so much. I have a real memory of going to my local library when I first moved to London, getting a bunch of books out of the library, and I picked this one up and read it in like one day. I read it so quickly. It is a young adult book that is told in verse, which is one of my favorite kind of writing styles, particularly when it comes to young adult books. And it's kind of this celebration of queerness and sexuality and embracing kind of gender identity. And this one was just such an enjoyable reading experience, so I would like to revisit it. And I recently found this copy secondhand. As I said, when I initially read it, I got it from the library, so I'd not had a physical copy of it. And now that I do have one, I would really like to revisit this story. And then finally, I would like to reread Ghosts by Dolly Alderton. Now, I read her nonfiction book, Everything I Know About Love, when I was maybe like 22, 23. It was when I was doing my master's. And oh my God, it opened my eyes. I thought it was like revolutionary in the things that it was kind of telling me about relationships and growing up. But I have no desire to reread that book because I feel like kind of the commentary and life lessons that are in that book, I feel like I've lived them now. And I just don't think it would be an impactful reread. But I read Ghosts, which was Dolly Alderton's first novel. I read it during the pandemic, so I must have been 25. But during the pandemic, I was reading so many books because like I had nothing else going on. I'd moved back into my mother's house. I had like no social life whatsoever. All I was doing was reading. And I have such strong memories of kind of my reading lifestyle at that time. And this was one of the books that I read that I absolutely loved. You know, I put several sticky tabs in it for particular sections. And I actually think there are a fair few books that I read during that really significant reading period of like the lockdowns that I would like to revisit now, like not being in that context. But I do also think it would be really intriguing to read this book now that I've had a lot more kind of like dating experience under my belt. I think at the time of reading this, I had a fair amount of dating experience, but I think certainly in the past few years, I did a lot more dating, and now being in a very like committed long-term relationship, I do think all of that kind of personal context would be interesting to bring to a reread of this book and see if I found it as impactful as I did when I was reading it when I was a little bit younger. So that's it. They are all of the books that I'm going to talk about that I would like to reread. As I said, there will be somewhat of a follow-up video to this, so I can specifically talk about the books by Irish authors that I would like to reread. And obviously, you know, when I go back to my mother's house, I might do another one where I can pick some other books off my shelf that I would like to reread. But this has been so much fun, and I think it's also been kind of a bit of a like reading journey discussion as well, like kind of talking you through kind of impactful books that I had like growing up and into adulthood. Let me know down in the comments if you are someone that likes to reread. Is it something you make time for, or is it something that, like me, you struggle to find time for? Is there a particular book that you would like to reread? If you want to let me know you're here but you don't have anything in particular to say, leave me a little ghost emoji in honor of Ghosts by Dolly Alderton. Anyways, that's it from me today. I hope you're well, and I'll speak to you in my next video.